Hello, my dear wanderers. It's Soren. Welcome back. Tonight we journey to the cold, distant echo of old battlefields, where the wind whispers over quiet trenches and the pages of history feel thin. We are searching for an unseen commander, a ghost in the seams of a forgotten tunic, whose quiet power shaped empires. Imagine the low glow of a simple lantern, and the smell of old wool and damp earth as we walk through the crowded camps of soldiers who never saw their real enemy. We trace the almost invisible footsteps of a tiny insect, a creature of comfort and fabric, whose accidental strategy changed the world. This is the story of Typhus, the forgotten plague, a quiet catastrophe moving from scene to scene. So, before you drift into sleep, take a moment to like and subscribe. Only if this brought you calm. Tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now dim the lights, take a deep breath, and let's drift into tonight's journey together. History, for the most part, is content to focus on the big, obvious players. The roaring cannons, the triumphant generals, the dramatic treaties signed on velvet tablecloths. It's a very visual, very loud business. But if you drift back through the centuries, through the cold and the mud of one forgotten campaign after another, you start to notice a persistent, unseen participant, a commander who rarely gets a statue, whose movements are invisible on any map, but who has quietly tipped the scales of power more reliably than any army could hope to. This, of course, is General Louse, and his strategy was simple: Typhus. Now, Typhus isn't like the bubonic plague. It doesn't have the same operatic, dramatic flair of sudden black swellings and dancing skeletons. It's much more insidious. It's the disease of the downtrodden, the unwashed, the crowded, and the cold. It's the quiet catastrophe that happens when the world simply stops caring about basic sanitation. The Greek word typhos means smoky or hazy, which refers to the delirious, stuporous state of the afflicted. It's the illness that makes you feel like your head is full of fog right before it puts you in the ground. And the general's transport: a tiny, humble insect called the body louse. Pediculus humanus corporis. The louse lives exclusively in clothing, particularly in the seams, and only visits the skin to feed. It's a creature of habit and comfort. Its life is simple: blood, warmth, and the snug fibers of unwashed wool. These conditions, as fate would have it, are the historical signature of the common soldier, the long-distance refugee, and the prison inmate. When one person's clothes touch another's in close quarters, the louse is on the move, silently ferrying the Rickettsia prowaziki bacteria from the sick and dying to the healthy. Generals often worried about the enemy's flanks. They should have been worrying about their own shirt seams. One of the earliest and most devastating documented appearances of General Louse on the battlefield was during the siege of Granada in 1489. This was the final push by the Catholic monarchs of Spain, Ferdinand and Isabella, to expel the Moors and complete the Reconquista. It was a massive, protracted military effort, and the Spanish army had all the advantages: superior organization, overwhelming force, and God on their side, or so they thought. But as the winter settled in around the fortified city of Baza, the army's living conditions deteriorated. Men were packed together, hygiene was non-existent, and the cold made changing clothes an impossibility. Perfect conditions for the louse. The Spanish commanders recorded that the men were not falling to enemy blades, but to a mysterious, sudden illness. It started with a high fever and headache, progressed to a red rash across the torso and limbs, and ended, often, in delirium and death. They lost about 3,000 men to the enemy during the entire siege. They lost an estimated 17,000 to the smoky haze of Typhus. The siege was successful in the end, but the cost was astronomical, a chilling foreshadowing of the true mortality rate of major warfare in the centuries to come. The victory belonged as much to the louse as it did to the crown of Spain. As the centuries drifted by, Typhus carved a deep, tragic groove through the history of Europe. It was ghoul fever, a common death sentence for those thrown into crowded, filthy prisons. The disease was so infectious that prisoners brought to court sometimes infected the entire courtroom, including judges and lawyers. In 1750, the Lord Mayor of London himself died after presiding over a trial, a testament to the louse's democratic appetite. It didn't care about a velvet robe or a powdered wig. If you had scenes, you were fair game. But the real show, the one that cemented the louse's reputation as the ultimate military strategist, came in the early 19th century with the ambitions of Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon, of course, was a man who understood numbers. He understood logistics, artillery, and the morale of men. He assembled the Grande Armée, a colossal force of over 500,000 soldiers drawn from 20 nations, and marched them toward Russia in 1812. His goal was to crush Tsar Alexander I and enforce the continental system, an economic blockade against Britain. It was the largest European army ever assembled, and Napoleon believed it was invincible. The initial phase of the campaign itself was a logistical nightmare. Long before the Russians engaged in serious battle, the heat was brutal. The supply lines were stretched thin, and the sheer number of men and horses quickly overwhelmed the resources of the land they marched through. The inevitable crowding of troops, especially at night and in rainy conditions, created the perfect microbial greenhouse. As the army slid eastward, the men began to fall in staggering numbers. This wasn't combat, it was fever. It was the crushing headache, the stupor, the bright red rash, the calling card of General Louse. The louse spread, the rickettsia from Polish soldier to French musketeer to German mercenary, indifferent to uniform or language. The men were too sick to stand, too delirious to march, and they died by the thousand. When Napoleon finally took the city of Vilnius in modern-day Lithuania, a major supply hub, the hospitals were immediately overflowing. The town quickly became a massive graveyard. The army continued to shrink, not from engagement, but from environmental and biological decay. At the Battle of Borodino, the first major engagement, Napoleon's army was already a shadow of its former self. And then came the retreat. The famous, brutal Russian winter did indeed finish the job, but it was Typhus that did the bulk of the initial quiet killing. The cold merely intensified the conditions. Men huddled closer for warmth, refusing to shed their lice-ridden clothing and sharing their microscopic demise. When the remnants of the Grande Armée limped back across the border, fewer than 40,000 of the original 500,000 were fit for duty. The numbers are a punch to the gut. Maybe 100,000 lost to combat, famine, and cold, but nearly 300,000 lost to diseases like typhus, dysentery, and other camp fevers. The Russian campaign didn't fail because of the genius of a Russian general. It failed because of the effective, invisible command of the louse. It was the most perfect, sleepiest example of biological warfare the world had ever seen, simply because the general didn't have to plan it. He just had to wait for humans to congregate in filth and despair. The louse, having successfully neutralized the most powerful military force in Europe, simply retreated back into the unwashed uniforms of the survivors, ready to wait for the next great human folly to create the perfect conditions for its next deployment. For a time, Europe seemed to learn its lesson, but historical memory, like an old wool tunic, tends to get frayed and dirty quickly. And as the world slid toward the 20th century, the louse found its greatest opportunity yet. The 19th century, supposedly a time of great progress and shining industrial advancement, proved to be an exceptionally fertile period for General Louse. While engineers were building steam engines and philosophers were debating human rights, the conditions for the louse crowding poverty and cold were being amplified by the rapid, chaotic growth of urban centers. The disease that history remembers as typhus was constantly mutating its persona, going by different, equally miserable names: jail fever, ship fever, and eventually famine fever. The association with the penal system was an old, grim joke. Before the 18th century, a judge's verdict of imprisonment could often be read as a thinly veiled death sentence. The filth of the overcrowded cells in places like Newgate Prison in London guaranteed the spread of the body louse. The jailers, the prisoners, the executioner, and anyone unfortunate enough to be within range of the typhus cloud, the dust of louse feces, were at risk. The louse wasn't a philosophical insect. It simply moved where the living was easy and the seams were warm. The era of Victorian expansion and global movement gave the louse its first great overseas voyage. The Industrial Revolution fueled massive migration, and the conditions of travel provided perfect mobile incubators. Ships, particularly those carrying poor emigrants, were often overcrowded, damp, and unsanitary. They became floating vessels of disease, earning typhus the nickname ship fever. When these ships arrived in North America, particularly in Canada, the louse and its deadly cargo stepped ashore, ready to participate in the American dream. The most catastrophic partnership between man and louse, however, occurred in the middle of the century, during the Great Irish Famine between 1845 and 1849. This was a tragedy born of agricultural dependence and political neglect, but its grim statistics were massively inflated by disease, and particularly by typhus. When the potato blight struck, it wasn't just a matter of people starving. It was a total societal collapse that created optimal conditions for the louse. Starving people lose weight, which causes their clothing to hang loose to stay warm. They often stuff the space between their skin and their clothes with rags or straw, creating an ideal, insulated habitat for the body louse. Desperate families, entire villages, fled their homes and crowded into temporary shelters, workhouses, and ports, all while wearing the same clothes for months on end. Hygiene became a luxury no one could afford, and thus General Louse took command. Typhus exploded across the country. It was referred to as famine fever, often alongside relapsing fever, which is also louse-borne. The cycle was cruelly efficient. Weakened by starvation, people were far more susceptible to the severe symptoms of the disease. The body louse, a meticulous creature of warmth, prefers a stable temperature. When its host develops a raging fever, a key symptom of typhus, the louse finds the temperature too high and promptly flees to a new, healthy host, efficiently spreading the disease. The louse's discomfort became a death sentence for the next person it encountered. The casualties were horrifying. The famine killed over 1 million people, but a significant portion of those deaths were attributed to fever, not outright starvation. The disease didn't discriminate between the peasants and the priests, the landlords and the doctors. An estimated 1 in 5 doctors in Ireland died of typhus. While trying to treat the sick, the medical profession was on the front lines, often contracting the illness through the simple act of examining a patient and inhaling the dust of infected louse feces from their clothes. As millions of Irish decided that a louse-borne death at sea was preferable to a louse-borne death on land, The typhus outbreak traveled with them. These were the infamous coffin ships, densely packed and disease-ridden vessels that carried the famine refugees to Britain and North America. Upon arrival, the disease was so virulent and widespread among the passengers that the public often simply referred to the fever as the Irish fever. In 1847 alone, an estimated 20,000 Irish immigrants died of typhus in Canada, primarily in quarantine sheds along the St. Lawrence River. The death rate was so high in the temporary quarantine camps, like Gros Isle near Quebec, that the sites became historical monuments to the louse's power. Even in a new world, the invisible general strategy remained unbeatable. Exploit human misery and lack of hygiene, and let nature take its smoky course. The tragedy of the Irish Famine, both in Ireland and in the diaspora, serves as a bleak marker of typhus's true historical weight. It wasn't merely a backdrop illness, it was an active participant in demographic change. The louse didn't cause the famine, but it maximized the devastation, ensuring that the misery was shared with lethal efficiency. The scientific understanding of this tiny assassin was, however, still in the dark. For centuries, typhus was lumped together with other fevers. There was no microbial theory of disease. Doctors were still operating under the vague atmospheric concept of miasma, bad air. The actual culprit, the body louse, was simply an accepted if annoying fact of life. People knew that lice were common among the poor, but they didn't know that the louse was the reason the poor died. It took the keen, patient observation of the French bacteriologist Charles Nicolle to finally unmask the commander. Working in Tunis in 1999, Nicolle noticed a curious pattern. Doctors and nurses in the typhus wards of the hospital frequently contracted the disease from their patients. But the disease stopped abruptly once the patients were stripped of their clothes and given a hot, disinfecting bath. The hospital environment itself, which should have been crawling with bad air, was surprisingly safe. The only difference, the crucial factor, was the transition from the filthy street clothes to the clean hospital gowns. Nicolle, with a brilliant and quiet, intellectual leap, deduced that the disease was being carried not by the patient's breath or skin, but by something living in the clothes. That something was the body louse. He proved his theory in the laboratory by transmitting typhus from infected monkeys to healthy monkeys using lice. It was a Nobel Prize-winning discovery, and it finally gave General Louse a name, a rank, and a precise mode of operation. The timing of this discovery, just 5 years before the outbreak of World War I, was historically crucial, and ultimately tragically ironic. The world now knew the identity of its ancient killer, but the conditions of the coming war were about to create an environmental disaster, so vast that even this new knowledge would struggle to keep up with the louse's relentless campaign. The Great War was about to provide the ultimate, industrialized laboratory for the transmission of epidemic typhus. The World War that began in 1914 was supposed to be quick, decisive, and glorious. Instead, it ground to a halt in the filth and stalemate of trench warfare. These deep, damp ditches, dug across France and Belgium, became the perfect human habitats for misery. However, despite the incredible crowding and the lack of sanitation, the Western Front, the trenches most people visualize when they think of World War I, was surprisingly spared the full, apocalyptic force of epidemic typhus. This was due in part to Charles Nicolle's recent discovery. Knowing that the louse was the culprit, the Allied armies, particularly the British and French, established the lousing stations. These were places where soldiers were systematically stripped of their clothes, bathed in harsh disinfectants, and had their uniforms sterilized by steam or heat. It was a miserable process, but it broke the critical transmission chain of the louse. Even so, the conditions still bred their fair share of unpleasantries. The louse did successfully spread trench fever, a milder, non-lethal but utterly debilitating illness caused by the bacterium Bartonella quintana. This disease, characterized by severe shin pain and relapsing fevers, ensured that hundreds of thousands of men were too sick to fight, occupying scarce hospital beds for months. The louse was still a major logistical headache, even if General Louse's main weapon, Typhus, was contained. But General Louse reserved his greatest, most devastating triumph for the Eastern Front. This theater of war was a different kind of horror. It was a war of vast, mobile campaigns, enormous prisoner transfers, massive refugee movements, and the complete collapse of civil infrastructure and medical services. Unlike the static trenches in the West, the East was defined by chaos, which is the Louse's preferred environment. When Austria declared war on Serbia in 1914, the conditions for a biological disaster were set almost immediately. The initial fighting resulted in tens of thousands of Austrian prisoners being crammed into Serbian camps. At the same time, Serbian cities were shelled, turning the population into refugees. Doctors and medical supplies were already scarce, having been funneled to the front lines. The ingredients were all there: overcrowding, cold, malnutrition, and zero hygiene. Typhus appeared among the Austrian prisoners near the town of Valjevo, and then spread with terrifying speed. The louse, oblivious to the political alignment, hitched rides on the clothes of the prisoners, the Serbian troops guarding them, and the refugees moving inland. Within a year, Typhus had brought Serbia to its knees. Upwards of 50,000 people died, including a third of the nation's doctors. The mortality rate was estimated to be between 60% and 70% in some areas. This Serbian outbreak became so infamous, so deadly, that the German and Austro-Hungarian commanders, who desperately wanted to capture the strategic crossroads of Serbia, feared invading the country more than they feared the Serbian army. The disease acted as a natural, microscopic defense mechanism. The louse had not only destroyed an army, but had managed to repel two great empires from an important conquest, simply by making the target territory lethally inhospitable. As the war churned on, the greatest typhus disaster unfolded in the East, specifically in the former Russian Empire. Typhus had always been endemic in Russia, a country of long, cold winters where people lived in close quarters, wearing heavy, rarely washed clothes. But the war amplified the conditions past the point of endurance. Millions of men were mobilized. Massive famine struck, and the country descended into revolution and civil war. The louse spread rapidly through the vast Russian army, decimating entire divisions. When soldiers were wounded or sick, they were sent west on the railway system, which meant the louse and riketsa traveled too. The war had created the most efficient biological transport system imaginable. The trains were packed beyond capacity with soldiers, refugees, and the walking wounded, all huddled together for warmth, turning every rail carriage into a mobile death chamber. Then came the Bolshevik Revolution and the subsequent Russian Civil War. During this period of utter societal collapse, the louse found its perfect chaotic playground. Food was scarce, heating was unreliable, and governmental authority, including public health initiatives, had vanished. Over 5 years from 1917 to 1922, the largest single epidemic of typhus in modern history swept through Russia and its neighboring regions. The numbers are difficult to grasp because the record-keeping itself had collapsed. But reliable estimates suggest that there were between 25 and 30 million cases of typhus, resulting in approximately 3 million deaths. This was a number far exceeding the direct combat casualties in the region. The invisible commander was once again proving his historical supremacy over human generals. Lenin himself noted that either the louse will defeat socialism, or socialism will defeat the louse. A remarkably blunt assessment of the true threat facing the new regime. The sheer scale of the epidemic was a direct result of the louse's biological preference for cold, crowded, and dirty environments. All trademarks of the prolonged conflict. The cold forced people to wear the same heavy louse-infested clothing, and the lack of soap and water meant that there was no way to break the cycle. The louse would lay its eggs or nits in the seams of the clothes, and an entire generation of soldiers and civilians lived their lives covered in the constant, itching presence of their tiny executioners. The louse had effectively decided the war in the East. It demoralized armies, crippled transport, and killed so many civilians that the demographic and economic damage was irreparable. The invisible general's strategy to let humans do the initial noisy destruction and then take over the cleanup with quiet efficiency had worked better than anyone could have imagined, and the final chapter of the louse's command was yet to be written, waiting patiently for the next global descent into chaos. The interwar period provided a slight temporary respite for much of Europe, and this lull allowed science to finally mount a counterattack against General Louse. Charles Nicholl had identified the enemy, but the real challenge was developing a weapon that could defend people without relying solely on the impossible task of keeping millions of war-torn citizens clean. This is where the Polish scientist Rudolf Weigel quietly entered the scene. Weigel, a zoologist and pathologist at a local university, now Lviv, Ukraine, became obsessed with conquering typhus. He knew the bacteria, Rickettsia provazaki, needed the body louse to live and spread. The louse itself was both the vector and the biological factory for the disease. If a vaccine was to be made, it had to involve the louse, which was a deeply unpleasant prospect. In the 1920s and 1930s, Weigel developed a method for growing the typhus bacteria in massive quantities, which was necessary for vaccine development. His process was ingenious, if incredibly macabre. He had to infect thousands of live lice and then harvest the Rickettsia from their guts. To do this, he first had to establish a thriving, healthy louse colony. Weigel's method involved the use of human louse feeders. These were people, often students, prisoners, or the unemployed, who agreed to have small wooden cages, known as wheel cages, filled with lice strapped to their thighs or calves. The lice would feed on the human blood several times a day for about 12 days, growing fat and numerous. It was a bizarre, itchy, and deeply intimate form of laboratory work, where the staff became literal walking incubators. Once the lice were mature, they were infected with the typhus bacteria by being injected into their rectums using a very fine glass needle. This procedure, called rectal inoculation, was painstaking, requiring microscopic dexterity. The infected lice would live for another week or two, during which the Rickettsia would multiply rapidly in their gut. Finally, the sick lice would be dissected, their midguts removed, ground up, mixed with carbolic acid, and filtered. This gruesome paste was the Weigel typhus vaccine. The development of this vaccine was a quiet, monumental achievement in public health, but it was also a historical curiosity. No other major vaccine production has relied so heavily on live human insect interactions. The louse feeders were at constant, small risk, but they were paid, and in the depressed economy of the era, the strange work provided a form of stable, if perpetually itchy, employment. Weigel's work, however, truly collided with history during World War II. After the Soviet invasion of Poland in 1939 and the subsequent German occupation in 1941, Lwow found itself under the control of the Nazi regime. Typhus, following the usual pattern of war and displacement, exploded, particularly in the overcrowded, unsanitary ghettos and concentration camps. The German command, well aware of the disease's devastating effect on their own troops during the Eastern Front of World War I, desperately wanted a reliable supply of the vaccine. They permitted Weil to continue his research, establishing the Weil Institute in Lablo, ostensibly to produce vaccine for German troops. Wiggle, however, turned his unique laboratory into an act of quiet, effective sabotage and humanitarian resistance. Knowing the Germans would not venture into his facility for fear of the lice, he gained significant autonomy. He leveraged his position by classifying hundreds of Polish intellectuals, resistance fighters, and Jewish people as louse feeders and technical staff. This designation provided them with essential German work papers, protected them from immediate deportation to death camps, and gave them access to better rations. The louse cages became tiny, life-saving shelters. The seemingly mundane act of having lice strapped to one's leg was suddenly a passport to survive. And the intellectual elite of Poland, once destined for destruction, spent the war years working as reluctant hosts to their microscopic overlords, safe from the larger human violence raging outside. Furthermore, Weigel and his staff intentionally smuggled the full-strength vaccine out of the institute. While the weak, standard batches were sent off to the German military, high-quality, life-saving doses were channeled into the ghettos of Labla and Warsaw. They hid the doses in bread loaves, in the soles of shoes, or in other innocent-looking containers. The man who dedicated his life to studying the louse used the louse, and the fear it inspired, to undermine a regime of terror. Weigel's quiet war on two fronts, against the bacteria and against the Nazis, saved thousands of lives. The louse feeder program became a surreal hidden node of resistance, demonstrating how the very mechanisms of a biological threat could be inverted for humanitarian aid. The development of the Cox vaccine in the United States in the late 1930s, a safer, easier to produce vaccine grown in egg yolks, would eventually replace Weigel's macabre louse gut method for mass production. But during the most desperate years of World War II in Eastern Europe, Rudolf Weigel's laboriously harvested louse-based vaccine was the only defense available, and it was used with quiet, heroic efficiency to fight both the tiny general and the human dictatorship. The louse was still spreading misery, but now, for the first time in history, there was a consistent, effective countermeasure born from the very creature that caused the devastation. The narrative of inevitable biological surrender was finally beginning to shift. Even with the invention of the safer Cox vaccine in the late 1930s, General Louse was far from beaten. The sheer scale of global conflict during World War II provided the louse with its most terrifying and industrialized hunting ground, the Nazi ghettos and concentration camps. In these places, every condition the louse thrived on, extreme crowding, utter filth, malnutrition, and bitter cold, was maximized by design. The infamous camps became factories of biological annihilation. In places like Auschwitz, Bergen-Belsen, and Dachau, typhus was not just an illness, it was an endemic feature of the landscape. The disease tore through the populations, already weakened by starvation and forced labor. Mortality rates in the camps from typhus often rivaled the number of people sent to the gas chambers in some periods. The louse operated in chilling tandem with the human brutality, ensuring that those who survived the initial horrors still faced a pervasive, itchy death sentence. The German authorities understood the danger of typhus. not out of humanitarian concern for the prisoners, but out of fear for their own guards and personnel. Typhus respects no boundaries, and a raging epidemic in a camp could easily spill over into the surrounding civilian and military population. This fear is what led them to tolerate figures like Rudolf Weigel and his vaccine operation in Wuhan. But it also spurred a desperate search for a widespread, cheap, and effective chemical solution to the louse itself. For centuries, louse control had been an exhausting, losing battle of combing, boiling clothes, and using harsh, often ineffective chemical agents. The body louse is a robust little survivor, and removing it from thousands of seams of clothing was a near impossible logistical task. The louse, in a sense, was protected by the very fabric of human clothing, but the war years saw the emergence of a chemical compound that promised to change the balance of power overnight. DDT, or dichlorodiphenyl trichloroethane. DDT was a synthetic organic insecticide discovered in the 1930s, and its properties were revolutionary. It was cheap to produce, stable, and highly effective against many insects, including the body louse. The deployment of DDT marked the first time that humanity possessed a weapon capable of combating the louse on the scale required by mass displacement and warfare. The strategic use of DDT began almost immediately when the Allies realized the potential for massive typhus outbreaks among troops and civilian populations in war zones, particularly in North Africa and Italy. The most famous, successful deployment of this new chemical counterattack occurred in Naples, Italy, in 1943. Allied forces had liberated the city, but the preceding chaos and the poor, crowded conditions led to a severe outbreak of typhus. It was the first time in modern history that an epidemic of typhus had struck a major Western city, and the situation threatened to become a disaster of Russian Civil War proportions. The Allied public health units responded with a revolutionary, industrialized delousing campaign. Teams were set up to systematically dust the entire population of Naples with DDT powder. People lined up, often skeptically, while workers blew the white powder into their hair, onto their skin, and most crucially, into the seams of their clothing. The technique was simple, fast, and devastatingly effective against the body louse. The Naples outbreak was stopped in its tracks. The transmission chain, which had operated almost continuous for centuries, was violently broken by the chemical agent. The speed and efficacy of the DDT dusting campaign became a landmark moment in medical history, proving that General Louse could, in fact, be defeated in a mass setting. The era of inevitable typhus epidemics seemed to be over, replaced by the reassuring, albeit toxic, fog of insecticide. This chemical victory was hailed as a triumph of modern science. The Swiss chemist Paul Hermann Müller, who was credited with discovering DDT's insecticidal properties, was awarded the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 1948. The louse, the invisible commander who had foiled emperors and slaughtered armies, was finally rendered harmless by a fine white powder. Following the end of the war, the typhus threat remained in the immediate aftermath, particularly among the millions of displaced persons and the survivors liberated from the camps. Delousing with DDT became a core component of humanitarian aid and military operations across Europe and Asia, preventing what could have been an even greater global public health catastrophe. The fear of typhus was a very real driver of post-war public health policy, ensuring that the historical lesson of General Louse was, for a brief time, thoroughly learned. The irony of this victory, of course, is that the very chemical agent that liberated humanity from the scourge of typhus eventually proved to have its own complex, long-term ecological and human costs, leading to its eventual restriction decades later. But in the immediate post-war context, DDT was seen purely as a savior, the weapon that finally defeated the quiet, unassuming insect general, who had commanded a greater mortality rate than all the human generals combined. The post-war world, armed with vaccines and the potent chemical warfare agent DDT, collectively decided that the chapter on General Louse and epidemic typhus was closed. In the developed world, with its rising standards of hygiene, accessible sanitation, and the ability to change clothes regularly, the body louse simply lost its foothold. The environment that sustained the rickets of Prowazeki, the environment of human misery, cold and extreme crowding, was largely dismantled across Western Europe and North America. But typhus, true to its hazy name, simply drifted into the shadows, becoming the forgotten plague in the consciousness of the modern world. It hadn't truly disappeared. It had just retreated to its natural, preferred habitats, the places where human suffering continued unabated. It remained a latent threat, capable of erupting whenever the conditions of modern life were violently reversed. The bacteria itself. Rickettsia prowazeki is a tricky survivor. It has a peculiar trick, a sort of biological ace up its microscopic sleeve, known as Brill-Zinsser disease. This is essentially a relapse of epidemic typhus, often decades after the original infection. A person who survived a typhus epidemic as a child might harbor the bacteria in a latent state for their entire life. Then, years later, perhaps due to age, stress, or a weakened immune system, the bacteria can reactivate. This relapse is significant because the person suddenly becomes infectious again. If that person is in an environment where body lice are present, a refugee camp, a homeless shelter, a prison, they become the biological spark that can ignite a massive new epidemic. It means that the human population itself, especially the aging survivors of past wars and famines, is a constant, quiet reservoir for the disease. General Louse doesn't need to find a new host species. He just needs the old, established ones to gather close again. And the opportunities for General Louse to strike again, even in the late 20th century, were provided by human conflict and natural disaster. Typhus cases continue to appear, though often localized and quickly suppressed, in areas where overcrowding and the breakdown of infrastructure occurred. These sporadic outbreaks served as faint historical echoes, reminders that the louse was merely resting, not dead. In the United States, typhus presents in a curious, almost domesticated form called sylvatic typhus. This is a rare strain of the bacteria found in flying squirrels, Glaucomys valone. The disease is transmitted to humans who handle the squirrels, their nesting material, or the occasional infected louse or flea that lives on the animal. It's an odd biological footnote, a reminder that the bacteria has other, smaller reservoirs when the massive human ones are inaccessible. The risk is small, but it shows the bacteria's persistence and adaptability, proving that the louse isn't the only possible vector, just the most efficient. The greatest fear regarding typhus today rests on the historical memory of what it does to armies and displaced populations. Military strategists and public health officials know that should a major long-term conflict occur, one involving mass displacement, the destruction of water treatment, and the collapse of heating systems, the louse will inevitably return to its command post. Consider the Balkans in the 1990s. Or areas of chronic conflict in Africa and Asia. Whenever populations are forced to flee quickly, abandon hygiene, and cluster together for safety and warmth, the potential for a typhus resurgence is immediate and real. The louse doesn't care about geopolitics. It cares about thermal regulation and blood meals. A refugee huddled in the cold, wearing the same clothes for 6 months, is simply a biological signal that General Louse is back on duty. The history of typhus is a persistent, sleepy warning about the fragility of civilization. Our protection against it is not primarily antibiotics, which are very effective once the disease is contracted, but the boring, everyday infrastructure of modernity, sanitation, soap, heating, and the easy access to clean, changeable clothes. The absence of typhus in daily life is a quiet testament to the success of public works and peacetime logistics, not necessarily to the strength of modern medicine. The phrase typhus, the forgotten plague, is a mild paradox. It's forgotten only because the everyday comforts of the modern world have pushed the louse back into the margins. But for anyone who studies the demographics of the Napoleonic retreat, the Russian Civil War, or the concentration camps, the plague is anything but forgotten. It's remembered as the silent, microscopic force that dictated the final outcome, a tragic reminder that the invisible commander is always lurking, waiting for the human system to break down and invite him back to the front lines. It simply waits for us to be disorganized, crowded, and cold enough to give it another chance at command. The 21st century arrived with a quiet confidence that the great epidemic diseases of the past were firmly under control. But history, with its peculiar habit of repetition, soon provided new opportunities for the body louse to re-emerge in a slightly updated, though equally miserable fashion. The fundamental truth remains: where there is profound, prolonged human displacement and lack of hygiene, there is potential for General Louse to convene his forces. The contemporary reappearances of typhus, while minor compared to the Russian nightmare, are concentrated in the few places on Earth that still consistently meet the criteria of cold, crowded, and filthy. These are often the highlands of certain countries, regions where poverty is extreme, or most predictably, refugee camps and prisons during times of political instability or environmental collapse. The louse is a simple creature, simply following its nose to the nearest stable, warm, unwashed environment. One of the less known, though significant, modern habitats for typhus is the prisons in various parts of the world, particularly those that suffer from severe overcrowding and neglect. Much like the ghoul fever of 18th century England, the contemporary prison system can become a closed loop of infection. Inmates are packed tightly together, often with limited access to laundry or bathing facilities, meaning the body louse establishes colonies with ease. The stress and malnutrition that accompany incarceration only increase the virulence of the disease once it takes hold, transforming a simple penal institution into a historical echo of the Black Assizes. Furthermore, the very dynamics of modern warfare and geopolitical conflict have created an almost perfect environment for a typhus return. Modern conflicts rarely result in the clear, static front lines of World War I. Instead, they produce rapid, massive movements of non-combatant populations. When millions of people flee their homes, they carry very little, and one thing they absolutely cannot afford to shed are their clothes. These worn, layered garments, used for warmth and carrying the familiar scent of home, quickly become the ideal hiding places for the body louse. Aid organizations and public health bodies are now acutely aware that in any major humanitarian crisis, a devastating earthquake, a civil war, a massive flood, louse-borne diseases are among the first and most serious threats to emerge. They are sometimes described as disaster-associated diseases. When the water supply is cut off and the sanitation system fails, the elegant structure of modern defense against the louse crumbles. Delousing supplies and methods are now a standard part of international relief efforts, a direct and humbling acknowledgement of the power of the tiny insect. The historical memory of the louse's decisive role in warfare has led to careful planning in the context of the recent conflict in Ukraine. For example, public health experts immediately raised the alarm about the potential for typhus. The conditions of the 1940s massive population displacement, fighting in cold urban areas, and the destruction of heating infrastructure were worryingly mirrored. While a full-scale epidemic has thankfully been averted largely due to modern surveillance and the immediate deployment of control measures, the mere fact that the threat is taken so seriously shows that general louse is no longer quite so forgotten by the people who study disease and logistics. Another subtle way the louse maintains its command is through the cultural narrative itself. The historical prevalence of lice and the diseases they carried has left a deep psychological scar on many cultures, particularly those in Eastern Europe and Russia. The constant battle against typhus and its cousin trench fever contributed to a deep-seated cultural fear of dirt, contamination, and the social stigma associated with louse infestation. Historically, to be lousy was to be marked as destitute, criminal, or an outcast. The same people who were biologically most susceptible to the disease. Even as typhus retreated, the memory of the louse as the biological marker of utter societal failure persisted. It is a quiet reminder that the most significant events in human history, the rise and fall of empires, the success or failure of a revolution, can often be traced back to the minute organisms that thrive when human systems fail to maintain basic cleanliness and order. The louse, in its gentle, ironic way, is the ultimate critic of human hubris. When we consider the history of medicine, we often focus on the grand discoveries, the invention of antibiotics, the eradication of smallpox, or the development of modern surgery. But the story of typhus and general louse offers a sleepier, more sobering lesson. The biggest public health victory was not a single dramatic invention, but the steady, boring, incremental advance of sanitation engineering and public works. The real defense against the invisible commander is hot water, cheap soap, and the ability to wash and change your clothes regularly. And so, we slide quietly into the final consideration of the louse's legacy, a legacy that remains strangely current, always one geopolitical meltdown or natural disaster away from returning to the headline. The invisible commander is still out there, patiently waiting for humanity to forget the simplest lessons of history. The great irony of General Louse is that his power rests on the simplest of human failures. He isn't a marvel of biological engineering like the malaria mosquito, nor does he possess the terrifying airborne speed of the influenza virus. The louse is a slow, pedestrian creature. It cannot fly, and it cannot jump. It relies entirely on direct contact, the brush of one sleeve against another, the huddle of two bodies for warmth, the simple shared surface of a garment, never washed. This simplicity is what makes the louse and its cargo, Typhus, the ultimate symbol of societal collapse. When everything else fails, the military campaigns, the political systems, the supply chains, the economy, the louse is there to deliver the final, quiet judgment. He is the ultimate ecological opportunist, patiently waiting for humans to create the perfect 19th century conditions in the 21st century world. The various historical names for typhus, gall, fever, camp fever, famine fever, are themselves a kind of historical report. They are place-based names that point not to a specific geographic region of origin, but to specific kinds of human suffering. They serve as a neat, sleep-friendly summary of the louse's requirements for operation: confinement, hunger, and war. The fight against General Louse has often been an embarrassing, desperate scramble before Charles Nicoll identified the vector. The desperate measures taken against typhus were often based on superstition or vague ideas about bad air. armies might try to burn sulfur or move camp, but as long as the men kept their clothes and the lice within, the disease remained a mystery. It highlights how utterly vulnerable humanity was to a threat it could neither see nor understand for centuries. The true difficulty wasn't in curing the disease, but in simply identifying the mode of transmission, even once the mechanism was understood. And even after the dramatic chemical success of DDT in Naples, the long-term solution remained fundamentally non-medical. The louse infestation is treated with pediculicides, and the disease is treated with antibiotics like doxycycline, which are very effective. But prevention, the true victory over general louse, lies entirely in civil engineering and social stability. When you consider the vast, terrifying death tolls, the 300,000 lost from Napoleon's army, the 3 million in the Russian Civil War, the hundreds of thousands lost in the Irish Famine, you realize that these are not numbers attributable to military tactics or political ideology. These are casualties of thermal regulation and textile access. They are the results of people being too cold to take off their clothes, too poor to afford soap, and too crowded to avoid contact. The modern world lives with the faint, residual fear of typhus, mostly in the form of the Brill-Zinsser disease potential. The idea that the plague is dormant within its survivors, always ready to wake up and start a new cycle. This means the louse doesn't even need to travel far. It just needs to find an aging survivor and a new batch of crowded, dirty companions to begin its work again. Ultimately, the story of General Louse is a profoundly anti-heroic one. There are no dramatic charges, no great intellectual debates about strategy, only the quiet, rhythmic feeding of a tiny insect that lives its entire life in the shadows of a human garment. He remains the most effective, most persistent, and most understated commander in human history, teaching a single simple lesson: that the health of society is measured not by the height of its monuments, but by the cleanliness of its scene. We must never forget the simplicity of his power, or the speed with which he returns when we become too chaotic, too crowded, and too cold. He is the invisible, sleepy threat that proves the true power of history lies in the smallest thing.